I have with me today Scott Ritter, former Marine and UN weapons inspector, to talk about the most up-to-date information on Russia, Ukraine, Zelenskyy, and Putin. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for coming on today's show.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So the news, there's a new theme in the news, and that is that Ukraine is basically ready to take the war offensively into Russia. Do you think that this is going to backfire? Is this the right move for Ukraine to defend itself and try to put Putin on his heels? Or is this going to backfire with 10 Ukrainians dying for every one Russian?
I mean, what we're talking about here is the drone strikes that have been taking place in Moscow and other areas of Russia. These are militarily insignificant drone strikes, so we can't speak of taking the war to Russia, so to speak. I think the Ukrainians have come straight out and admitted the purpose of this. It's not to, blow up a defense factory or to, kill Russian soldiers. It's to make the Russian people, especially the citizens of Moscow, experience what they say the Ukrainians are experiencing, the attacks. And I understand viscerally what the Ukrainians are saying about, except the following. They've just admitted to a war crime because it's a political objective, not a military objective. There's no legitimate military purpose for this. The purpose is to instill fear in the hearts of the Russian population using random violence. That's the definition of terrorism. If somebody did that here in the United States and got arrested for it, they'd be prosecuted as terrorists, not people carrying out legitimate military operations. So there's the problem, is that this isn't going to achieve what they wanted to achieve. First of all, I was just in Russia, and I'll testify firsthand that the Russian people, while they're going to be concerned about this, as anybody would, any sane person would be concerned about drones impacting on high-rise apartments in any city that they lived in. They're not going to be intimidated by this. The Russian people are solidly behind the Russian leadership, the leadership of Vladimir Putin, the president. They support the objectives of the Russian government in this special military operation. And they believe that this conflict needs to go until which time Russia prevails. They recognize this as a struggle of existential importance, that they can't lose this war. So having a couple drones pop off, it'll scare some people, but it's not going to intimidate anybody. And so the answer is it's going to backfire, because what's going to happen now is not only are you getting the opposite reaction that than you wanted. So you're failing. You haven't terrorized these people into submission. You've terrorized them into anger. You've doubled their resolve. You made them more resilient. And there's going to be consequences. The Russian government has always said that if Russia has not declared war on Ukraine. I think that's just a fundamental understanding people sometimes overlook. This isn't a war. It's a war-like situation. But if this was a war, a genuine war, Kiev wouldn't exist anymore, not as you recognize it. Kiev would be leveled to the ground. The presidential palace would be smoldering ruins. The parliament would be an empty shell. Many of the people who currently occupy those buildings would be dead or driven underground. The people of Kiev wouldn't be able to go shopping. They wouldn't have electricity. They wouldn't have running water. They wouldn't be able to drive, take trains, do anything. Right now in Kiev, they live a normal life. I mean, yeah, it's a life where you have to look over your shoulders every once in a while, things go boom. So I guess it's not really normal, but the bottom line is people get up and go to work. People take the train. People drive cars. They go to shopping centers. People go to restaurants. People go to parties. They have bars. It's not a city at war in the traditional way. It may soon become a city at war because Russia will retaliate. And when they do so, it'll be done in a manner which is consistent with international law. I mean, Russia's not going to go out there and pound civilian areas, but they're going to hit legitimate command targets, presidency, the Ministry of Defense, the parliament, decision-making centers inside the Ukrainian government where the decisions to do things such as order drones to strike Moscow are made. And we also have to remind ourselves that we're transitioning into the fall and the winter season. There's a premium on energy supplies at a time, electrical generating equipment, etc. This is all going to be targeted. The Russians are going to take it out. The Ukrainians are going to enter the coldest part of the year with nothing to keep them warm. And they only have their government to blame because their government's the one that thought that they could bring the war to Russia. The war is going to be brought home to Ukraine tenfold.
Yeah. So do you think right now they're trying to use the terror of the drones and these attacks on Moscow maybe to persuade the people to not back Putin on this war?
The Ukrainians have actually articulated, Mikhail Podolyak, he is a presidential advisor to Zelenskyy. He has articulated in a very cogent fashion the Ukrainian strategy. On the ground, fighting, they want to get to Melitopol, which is a city in the land bridge connecting Crimea with the rest of Russia. It's about 84 kilometers. Let's give the Ukrainians 2-kilometer credit for what they've done over the course of the past couple months. So we'll call it 82 kilometers away from the front lines. If you take this, you cut off the main north-south highway. Crimea becomes isolated, and any forces in the Melitopol area will be able to bring effective fire down on Crimea, which is something the Ukrainians have said they want to do. That's their goal militarily. They know they're not going to reach this goal and objective because if they do that, they can declare military victory at that point in time. It would be a significant military victory for them, but they're not going to do that. What they want to do is threaten that, thereby getting the people of Crimea to be concerned. What happens if they take Melitopol? You engender a little bit of concern there, and you also engender concern in Moscow and St. Petersburg and other Russian cities. And then what they want is to achieve some sort of intermediate objective. They'd like to be able to get to that first line of defense. They'd like to be able to breach that first line of defense. They'd like to be able to grab some territory and hold on to it. And what that does is it gives the Russians a bloody nose at a time when the Russians have said no more bloody noses, meaning the Russians mobilized 300,000 troops. They have 150 to 180,000 volunteers. They have the biggest army that they've ever had in the region, the best equipped army. They've had months to prepare this defense, and suddenly, bam, the Ukrainians reach out, punch them in the nose, and they're sitting there with a broken nose and bleeding. They haven't lost the fight, but everybody's shocked. It's like Mike Tyson going into the ring, and in the first 30 seconds, somebody hitting him in the face and putting him down. Tyson gets up, he still has fight, but the whole crowd is now going, whoa, what just happened? And so that's what the Ukrainians want to achieve there. And then they want to tie on to that these deep strikes, which, as I said earlier, have no real military purpose, but they're designed to engender doubt, engender fear, engender terror in the hearts and minds of the Russian people. The goal then, therefore, is to get people to say, we need to stop this war, to lose faith in the leadership of Vladimir Putin, and to carry out what they call the Moscow Maidan, the Maidan being the square in Kiev, where in February 2014, the Ukrainian nationalists were able to gather and through use of violence overthrow the constitutionally elected government of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych, replacing him with the nationalist government that in various iterations continues to rule to this day. The Ukrainian objective is a Moscow Maidan, Manege Square, to get Russians to rally there and to bring down Vladimir Putin from within. The Ukrainians know that they cannot militarily defeat Russia. What they're looking for, because they understand that war is an extension of politics by other means, that the best way to beat Russia is like how the Vietnamese beat the United States. Did we lose the war? How many battles did we lose in Vietnam? Not many. We won almost every battle we fought. Our troops, when they were on the battlefield, dominated the battlefield. But we lost that war because America lost the political will to continue the fight. And what the Ukrainians want to do is create the notion that this war will never end. It's a never-ending war. And if Russia keeps doing this, they're just going to get punched in the face repeatedly by the Ukrainians. And then confronted with this reality, the Russian people will rise up against Vladimir Putin. That's the goal. That's the objective of the Ukrainians in this fight.
Okay. CIA Director Bill Burns says that they're having some of their very best recruiting for spies right now within Russia, Russian citizens, people within the government. Do you think that this is, I mean, obviously they're looking for intel that they can use against Russia, but are they looking for an assassination opportunity, or do you think that they're just trying to spook Putin so that he becomes even more paranoid about who might be around him? Or what do you think the CIA's objective with trying to infiltrate the inner circle of Putin with spies is? Or is it just a great talking point on the internet?
Well, let me put it this way. The CIA has always tried to infiltrate the inner circle of any adversary or competitor government. It's not news. It's not as though the CIA woke up today and said, we need to get somebody inside Putin's inner circle. They've been trying to do that since Putin came into power in 1999. The way you don't do it is to advertise. All right, I was an intelligence officer. I know how these things work, especially in the human intelligence field. You just don't talk about it, about any aspect of it. It's not even to be whispered. You don't acknowledge it at all. So you have to ask yourself, why would the CIA director suddenly come out and talk about this? Because first of all, what are the Russians going to do when they receive this information? Well, I'll tell you what the Americans would do if the Russians came out and said, yeah, we've had great success penetrating the Department of Defense, the Department of State. We even got some people in the White House and National Security Council. We're the best intelligence we've ever had in the world. We'd immediately turn our security people on and start reviewing everybody, creating distrust, unrest, suspicion. People are going to be looking around going, see the guy? See the gal? What's going on? And that's what we want the Russians to do. Remember, I told you, Moscow Maidan. We want to create a situation where the people lose faith in the government. So now, at a time when people are critical of, for instance, the Russian Ministry of Defense, because of what Yevgeny Prigozhin, the director of Wagner, said was incompetence and corruption. He inserted that notion into the minds of the Russian public. Now the CIA is saying, hey, we're having great luck, great success. And people are going to say, man, maybe the CIA did get some people in there, and that's why Prigozhin's saying there's incompetence and all this stuff. This is a mind game being played by the CIA director. I'll tell you the following. They're having no luck with the Russians, none whatsoever, because Russia is a denied area. The Russian target is harder today than it has been at any time since the Cold War. When we had, again, you just got to think like an intelligence officer. How do you get into Russia? There's two ways normally. One is through diplomatic cover. You work through the embassy or through consulates. You go in there. The Russians usually have that figured out pretty good. Their arrest record of covered diplomats working for the CIA is quite high. They've rolled up a lot of our station operatives. So we're not having too much look at it. The other way is through non-official cover, the NOCs. But to have a NOC operating inside Russia means you have to have social connectivity with Russia. People have to be traveling in and out of Russia because you're operating undercover, and that cover has to be believable and deniable. A NOC is what they call the gray person. They go around and nobody notices them going around. They're not high profile. You know what an American traveling in Russia is today? Any American? High profile. Why? Nobody's traveling in Russia. So William Burns knows that the Russians know, the Russian professionals know that he's not doing. How do they know? Because they've rolled everything up. In 2 years ago, the CIA put out an unprecedented memo. A lot of people have forgotten about this. There's a memo went out to all stations warning them about specific communications methodologies that had been used to communicate with human assets, spies, people we recruited, because we lost everybody. We lost them in China. We lost them in Iran. We lost them in Russia. Why? Because it was compromised. They said, don't do this anymore. If we lost all our assets 2 years ago, and Burns wants us to now to believe that we've suddenly rebuilt agent networks that take decades to build at a time when Russia is more close to us than ever before, that's some significant hallucinogenic drugs that he's asking us to consume, because it isn't happening. The Russians know it. This is being done for domestic political consumption. The CIA is going to be called to task very soon for what will be yet another gross intelligence failure, the failure of Ukraine. Ukraine is losing the war. The CIA played an important part in this conflict in helping generate this conflict through its support, multi-decade support of the Banderas ultra-nationalists who are in control, and its covert support to the Ukrainian military, helping facilitate the flow of munitions, and its intelligence support to the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian military. All of this is failing. The Russians are winning. The CIA is losing. And at some point in time, they will be called before the United States Congress and held to account. And so what Burns is doing right now is trying to put lipstick on a pig, trying to positively spin something that can't be positively spun. I will guarantee you right now, I'll put my reputation on the line. The CIA hasn't had a major recruitment success in Russia at all. Because if they did, Stephen, they wouldn't be talking about it. I can guarantee you that. You don't talk about it. You don't hint it. You don't do anything. Who does William Burns think we are? The dumbest people on the planet? I don't want to answer that question.
Well, yeah, the whole thing is so bizarre because it's like, okay, why is American CIA announcing how successful they're being with getting spies to infiltrate Putin? And why is Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying, we've got this counteroffensive, here's how we're ramping up, this is what we plan to do, by the way, we have no ammunition? Like, why would you be announcing from the rooftops any plans if it wasn't like misdirection? It just hasn't made any sense to me as I've tried to follow it.
It's a voice of desperation. Do you remember in April 2003, Baghdad Bob, the guy we called Baghdad Bob, the Iraqi government spokesperson? And every day he would come out and he's doing his duty. I have no hard feelings against the guy. He had an impossible job to stand there in front of the cameras and tell the world that Iraq was winning the war. In his last broadcast, when he was broadcasting saying, no, the Iraqis are here, there's no American tanks. Behind them, American tanks were rolling. Oh. So I'm saying there's no American tanks, they're rolling. Zelenskyy, Burns, everybody else, they're the modern day equivalent of Baghdad Bob. They're here trying to spin the story in a way that doesn't make it appear what it actually is, an absolute total Russian victory.
Wow. You're familiar with journalist Seymour Hersh. He's the one that broke the story that Biden and the U.S. Navy dive team were behind the explosion of the Russian pipeline into Germany. He has now come out and said that he has intel sources that he's not willing to reveal that are saying that the United States played a much larger role in blowing up the Crimean Bridge than they want to be known. They're trying to let Ukraine take all the credit for that. Do you think there's any truth to that? Was this American technology? He's saying it was like a shallow, basically like a shallow torpedo, that Ukraine would not have this technology. Only the United States would have that.
Well, let me put it this way. I've known Seymour Hersh personally for 25 years. I consider him to be a very close friend. And I'd like to believe that he reciprocates that feelings towards me. but as close friends, I can tell you that the one thing we don't do is talk about his stories, and he doesn't talk about his sources. Um, One of the reasons why Seymour Hersh is the successes that he is that um, he has a reputation that if you talk to him, you don't get arrested. If you talk to him, nobody knows your name because he protects his sources. His reputation also is that the stories he writes, more often than not, far more often than not, turn out to be exactly right, that his sources are good. Is he perfect? No. There are examples where he has been led down the primrose path by a source who was lying to him, and Seymour Hersh, even being the good investigative journalist he is, was unable to uncover the lies. He got too close to the story, too close to the narrative, believed the source without quite checking it, and ended up publishing things that weren't accurate. But by and large, he's a man who has a stellar reputation, Pulitzer Prize winning guy who broke some of the biggest stories out there. And if you're somebody of his stature in Washington, D.C., with the reputation he has, people will talk to you. So I find it highly plausible that Seymour Hersh has a source that has the knowledge that is being written about by Hersh in his articles. I have no reason to doubt Seymour Hersh's source or Seymour Hersh's storytelling, meaning how he is taking this information, turning it into story. Understand that he has to shape it in a way that protects the source. The way I'm pretty good at reading articles and at the end of it saying, I know exactly who talked to this person. It's a good intelligence officer who knows the subject and knows the environment can do that. I have played that game with Seymour Hersh's articles. I have gone through and said, who did this? And I can come up with a list of names, but I can't come out and say, that's the guy. He protects them pretty well. But it also means that certain aspects of his story are going to be fuzzy, meaning not as much detail as you'd like. And it's in the fuzziness that sometimes people attack his story and say, well, he's wishy-washy here, he's not firm here, etc. But he can't be because he has to protect his source. If somebody's telling Seymour Hersh that the U.S. was more involved in the strike against the Crimean Bridge than has been acknowledged to date, I'd be willing to take that to the bank. I have that much confidence in Seymour Hersh, but I can't sit here and say that I personally vouch for his source. I don't know his source, and I can't say that this isn't one of those occasions where Cy Hersh made a rare mistake. That's always a possibility. But given who he is, given just the nature of the story, I put it in the more likely than not category.
Yeah. He mentioned, I believe it was in an interview with Brian Rose over at London Real, that when he broke the news about the Nord Stream pipeline, he specifically used language that Biden and the White House would know was pointing out how real his source was without revealing who the source was. So he kind of cryptically mentioned that he snuck in messages that Biden and the White House would be like, oh, shoot, ignore this story. He's on to more than we want the public to know.